This was the scene of the Kent State University on May 4th, 1970. On that day, 29 Ohio Guardsmen shot more than 60 rounds at students attending Kent State. They killed 4 and wounded 9 others. Now you may be wondering why the Ohio National Guard was at a university, or why they had to shoot students who were unarmed. To answer these questions, we have to understand the context in which this event happened. The United States was already fighting overseas in Vietnam. Many Americans, especially younger students such as those at Kent State, thought that the U.S. shouldn't be involved in Vietnam. Not only as a practical matter, as it was costing their tax dollars to fight a war which wasn't very effective, but also because many younger citizens, especially students, saw the war as an extension of U.S. imperialism and interventionist policies which they couldn't support, as they thought that the United States had no right to control small countries, such as Vietnam, that couldn't defend themselves. Additionally, many critics of Nixon posited that the president only continued the fight in Vietnam to boost approval ratings and ensure re-election. For these reasons, protesting the war was commonplace throughout the nation, especially at college campuses. Protests and opposition to the war became even more prevalent after December 1969, when President Nixon issued a draft lottery. This essentially held that any able-bodied person fit to serve in the military might be elected to do so. Since the war was so unpopular, many felt that forcing people to fight for a cause that was something so dubious and just blatantly a power play for Nixon would be unfair to put American citizens in the line of fire. Despite the introduction of the draft, the general consensus was that the Vietnam War was slowing down during 1969 and 1970. That is, until President Nixon announced the Vietnam expansion into Cambodia, which essentially meant that we were getting further into the war. A specifically interesting note is that President Nixon did not seek congressional authority on sending more troops into Cambodia. In fact, he kept bombings of Cambodia secret for more than a year before releasing them to Congress or the public. This gave evidence to those who believed that Nixon was using the war as a political tool to maintain positive approval ratings and then run for re-election. The day after the expansion was announced, students at Kent State began protesting more vehemently than they had in the past. For example, on May 1st, one day after the announcement was made, history students at Kent State buried a copy of the United States Constitution, showing that Nixon had violated, in their opinion, the constitutional requirement of separation of powers. They also protested the ROTC, which is a military organization, building that was left on campus. Their message was clear: we oppose the United States' action in Vietnam and those who support it. One of the best examples of student protest against the Vietnam War comes from Bill Arthrell, who is a history major at Kent State. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, he circulated flyers advertising that he would napalm a dog publicly. Now, people from the community were concerned, and so the day of, law enforcement and concerned members of the community showed up. But he didn't napalm the dog. Instead, he asked if they would stop him from napalming the dog. Obviously, most people said that they would. But then he asked, why don't you stop the US government from doing it to innocent civilians in Vietnam? This is one of the most influential protests to people in the community. In fact, a local security officer named Ron Kane, who responded to the event, said that this demonstration has changed the attitude I've had about the students here from the previous times I was on campus. He added, what I've seen here has impressed me with the orderly and responsible way in which the students have acted. I am pleased with the student response to trying to stop this thing. After April 30th, on May 1st through 4th, there were numerous protests and marches involving hundreds of students from Kent State. Now, to be fair, there were instances of looting and vandalism from the protesters, but on the whole, this was very small compared to the large number of people participating in the event. And most of those people were protesting well within their constitutional rights. In light of the vandalism and violence, the National Guard was called in on May 2nd, 2 days before the shooting, to restore peace and disperse the crowd if something like this were to happen again. The protests continue on May 3rd, and there were riots in downtown Kent. Around 11 p.m. it was announced that a curfew had been in place, which stopped most of the protests, although there were a few students that had been bayoneted by guards by that point. On May 4th, the day of the shooting, there was a protest that had been scheduled a few days earlier. The university tried to ban the gathering and even handing out faked pamphlets which claimed the event was canceled. In spite of this, around 2,000 people gathered on the Commons. They started by ringing a victory bell, which was typically used to signal football wins. Then the National Guard showed up and tried to disperse the crowd. Now, it's debated whether the crowd was lawfully required to disperse, but ultimately a court ruling ruled that they were required to disperse. However, students did not disperse and instead continued demonstrating. At around 12:15, a group of soldiers from the National Guard retraced their steps back to the Commons, which had the highest concentration of students. Then, at approximately 12:24, a single National Guards member pulled his pistol and started firing. In under 15 seconds, 29 National Guards members had pulled their M1 Garand rifles and fired approximately 67 rounds into the protesters. However, they also hit non-protesters, including 2 of the 4 victims which were fatally wounded. Now, this is all that can be definitively said about the event. There's a widely held theory that the National Guards members were ordered to fire and that it was a group effort, which contradicts the claims of the Ohio National Guard, which was that it was in self-defense. For example, here are some clips from what the Adjutant General of the Ohio National Guard had to say on the self-defense issue.
And he has a right to protect himself.
However, it's not clear that it was a self-defense issue. For example, here's him saying that he doesn't know whether the Ohio Guardsmen shot first or someone else provoked them.
I don't know where the first shot came from.
And furthermore,
General, do you know whether or not that first shot was fired by a guardsman?
I do not know.
the Ohio Guardsmen gave no indication they were going to shoot until actually pulling their rifles. For example, listen to this reporter ask about the absence of such a warning.
There was no warning given of the intention to fire, was there?
No,
Why is that?
because the situation didn't allow for any warning time.
Yet the situation allowed for the guardsmen to turn around in an orderly fashion and then fire their rifles. We have to keep in mind that these reports are not necessarily completely accurate as they are given by the National Guard itself. For example, here's the Adjutant General of the National Guard giving a statement on the length of the shooting.
The entire period was a matter of 2 or 3 seconds.
If you thought that statement was given in haste or perhaps out of context, here's him saying the same thing yet again.
All the firing was completed in a matter of 2 to 3 seconds.
Now we have to mention what happened directly after the shootings, because students are in a state of dismay and disbelief, and they're angry at the Ohio Guardsmen for shooting the unarmed protesters and innocent students alike. They're very angry. In fact, here's a clip of a student yelling that students should get guns and shoot back at the Ohio Guardsmen.
Then he gets himself a gun and shoots back. That's about the only answer. Don't go home, just get out of here and then be back.
Now, at this point in time, we can definitely see that a lot of the students have a lot of anger and emotion pent up, and they're ready to take that out and retaliate against the guardsmen. If things had gone how these protesters were talking and yelling about, the death toll for the May 4th massacre would probably be 20 or 30, or who knows. It would have been a complete bloodbath. Primarily, I think we can thank a faculty member named Seymour Barron. He gave a speech specifically addressed to the people trying to fight back, trying to bring guns, trying to incite violence. What he did is he firstly acknowledged that they were righteous, that these protests, they were for a good cause.
I want you to understand that the faculty is with you with regard to this Vietnam thing. We're with you. We're with you.
However, then he reminded them what had just occurred moments before.
We've had bloodshed. It's a terrible thing that's happened today. This campus will never forget it.
Then he basically instructs them on how to solve this problem.
So listen, for heaven's sake, cool it, calm it, and enjoy the sun. Those guys will stay there for a while. Their feet will start to hurt. Maybe they'll go home.
This compromise shows that even though you might be right when you're protesting, sometimes the smartest thing to do is to just let it go temporarily right then, because you have to realize it's emotional, and no doubt if they were to stay, it would have ended in a bloodbath.